Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a modern campaign agency dedicated to using data-driven grassroots organising to build winning campaigns and make the world a better place. So whether you're in business, issue-based campaigns, or an organisation that's driving change in your community, Dunn Street develops strategies to overcome challenges by connecting people that share the same values and organises them from the ground up to achieve their common goals. To find out more about how Dunn Street can partner with your organisation or your business or your social movement, hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. And welcome to Episode 8 of Socially Democratic, a weekly centre-left political and cultural podcast that is slowly developing into a centre-left political and sporting podcast that will dive into the progressive issues of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. On today's episode, we'll be joined by the ACTU's Assistant Secretary, Liam O'Brien. Liam and I talked about his entry into the trade union movement, the ACTU's Change the Rules campaign, and where it goes from here after the federal election, the future of industrial organising and the approaches that unions are now taking to build power in workplaces. And we also talked a little bit about the Democratic primaries that are happening right now over in the United States. And of course, we finished it off with sport, and we did you all the favour by putting that at the end of the podcast. Liam is a very good cyclist. So we did a bit of a quick preview of the Tour de France, which kicks off in France, or in Belgium rather, this coming weekend. Thanks to everyone who gave us really great feedback about our Democratic Primaries podcast with Sam Schneidman, our good friend over in San Francisco. And if you want to leave us any feedback, just drop us a comment on any of our Dunn Street socials. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And don't forget, the podcast is now available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and where all good podcast apps are available. And if you want to leave us a rating and a review and you use Apple Podcasts, we strongly encourage you to do that. That would be fantastic. Give us a 5 stars and a bit of a feedback about why you enjoy the podcast. And I read them all. And I make sure that we try and adjust the podcast in a way that's interesting for everyone. And obviously make sure that you share the podcast episodes on all of your various social media applications that you frequent. And don't forget, if you want to get updates about the podcast, just follow us at Dunn Street on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. So let's get to this week's episode. Liam O'Brien, welcome to Socially Democratic.
Thanks for having me.
Is this the first time you've been on a podcast?
Definitely the first on a podcast.
Do you listen to podcasts?
I do. I was lamenting with a mate the other day who I traditionally listen to a lot of American political podcasts. I think probably because it's the best way to sort of digest what's going on in a given week. And I sort of lamented to them that it was sort of getting to that stage in the presidential cycle where I better start listening again. Which has been made much more difficult with this current role where, unlike as an organiser in a union, you spend most of your time in a car and you've got endless hours to sit there and listen to podcasts, whereas, largely being office-bound now, you tend to find less of those opportunities. So I do like a good podcast. I like yours. I started listening to yours as well, which is good. It's definitely filling a narrative in the niche in the Australian podcast lexicon that I think is an important voice.
This is an excellent start to the podcast. I feel like you may be coming back again. We will talk about the US Democratic primaries maybe later on in the show, but let's start with your good self. I want to know about how, because when you first got involved in young Labor politics, I think I'd moved to South Australia, so I missed your coming into the broader Labor movement. How did you get involved in the first place?
So I first joined the party when I was 14, so we're now getting on sort of 24 years ago. I grew up in a Labor household. My mum, I was raised by a single mum. She was very pro-Labor. Politics was always discussed in our family, and it was important to have a view. So I think my politics has been shaped by her more than anything else. I think also being raised by a single mum gave me an appreciation of some of the struggles that she had. Raising 2 kids on her own wasn't easy, and she worked for the Work Care Appeals Board back in the day under the Kane government, and she was one of the first people sacked by Jeff Kennett when he won in '93. And I think as a 12-year-old, it's probably one of the earliest memories I have of that day. And she'd tell us stories about what it was like at work and injured workers and dealing with the challenges of that. And I think I was probably too young to appreciate the sort of politics around it, but I definitely came to appreciate the fact that Labor governments and unions play a really important role in working people's lives, and in particular around issues of economic justice. That was something that Mum talked about a lot.
Jeff Kennett has been the catalyst for so many young people's careers in the broader Labor movement.
Best recruiter the party's probably had in Victoria for a long time.
I really think so, because that's sort of very similar to my own story about my cousins and all that worked in the Latrobe Valley in the open cut. Open, it's funny you say the open cut. I say the open cut, but I don't think people use that term anymore. Yeah. Basically, the power industry up there. Yeah. And when he privatised it all, they all got made redundant, and that kind of really pissed me off.
Absolutely.
I was sort of 17, 18 at the time, and I wanted to do something about that, and that sort of was the first time I realised I had to take action if I wanted to. Yeah. Do something to support my family. When can you consider the first time that you understood the concept of unionism?
I don't reckon I really understood it until I'd properly started working at the ACTU. So I understood broad concepts of unionism, but I actually don't think you really quite appreciate what unionism can do for somebody until you've had the task of organising workers. And I think, I wouldn't say it's my fondest memory, because I don't think you'd think of these things in a sort of fond way, but quite early on when I was at the ACTU, talking about the Latrobe Valley, one of my earliest campaigns that I worked on and was responsible for was organising chicken farmers out in Pakenham, Narnagoon and Warrigal.
In the swamp.
Yeah. And it was a challenging organising task, the idea of having to go and visit these workers. You actually had to shower onto the farms because of biosecurity, which you think about the challenges that union officials face today as right of entry laws get tightened. The idea of having to strip off in front of the boss and hop in a shower, trust me, no pain of now being walked to the lunchroom compares to that.
Yeah.
So it presented a heap of organising challenges, and I sort of, recalled being a sort of a Labor activist at the time, and, you sort of 22, 23, thinking about what are you going to do? Is this union thing for you? Do you want to go and do something else in the broader Labor Party and politics? And the power that you've got to fundamentally change a group of working people's lives in ways that not even government can really quite do is really significant. And this was a group of workers who had really fallen through the cracks of awards. Some of the few workers that could have their 38-hour week sort of arranged across any day of the week, with their penalty rates had been completely cut. They hadn't had wage increases for a very long time, and they were mainly casual. And by the end of the campaign, not only had they sort of gotten a reasonable wage increase, they'd landed secure jobs, we'd restored penalty rates, and in many cases we were talking increases in their sort of weekly take-home pay of sort of circa 20 to 30%, which as a sort of outcome is sort of life-changing for a lot of people in an area that, as you know, is not a great area for sort of economic justice and sort of social mobility. So that was definitely the most powerful and impactful campaign that I worked on in terms of what shaped my idea of unionism. But I think in terms of sort of broadly at the ACTU, you become a real jack of all trades by virtue of the coverage. As I said, one day you're organising chicken farmers, the other day you're organising funeral home workers or steel workers. So it really taught me that the power of people collectively working together is far better than the powers of government to implement a particular policy that can change people's lives.
What inspired you to act in the first instance, be it political or industrial? Was there a moment in your younger life where you witnessed something and said, oh, that's not fair, I need to get off my bum and do something about that?
So the 2001 federal election, So Kim Beazley was the leader. That was probably the first election I actively got involved. I'd sort of handed out at elections before. And I think for me, it was not so much the function of it being, an election where an issue necessarily captured my mind, but I definitely I was out of school. I had the sort of freedom to sort of pursue, my interests. And it was that election that really got me far more involved. And quite frankly, it was the defeat of Kim Beazley at that election that really made me sort of wake up and say, you got to keep doing this.
Why is that?
Well, I sort of compare the situation we're in now to the one then, and I sure as hell hope we're not in the 2001 repeat. But I think the expectation that we were going to win in 2001 that far out meant that I'd mentally moved to a point of what a better country would look like, and the loss of it was quite crushing. And I think a lot of people today are going through similar experiences in terms of the 2019 election. Definitely we're seeing it in terms of, activists within unions and in workplaces who had, visions of what a Shorten-led government would do for working people, and have realised that, nothing is taken for granted anymore, that nothing is a given, that you've really got to keep fighting for these things. And I think that's, how I felt in 2001.
Speaking of Bill, when you were at the AWU, certainly when you were starting out, Bill was the branch secretary, and I think he went on to become the national secretary for a long period there as well. Those of us in the labour movement that know Bill sometimes feel like there was a view out there for a while that there was two different types of Bill. There was like AWU Bill, the people that knew Bill when he was the secretary of the union, and then there was Labor leader Bill. Yeah. Just give us an insight into the Bill that you knew when you were working at the Australian Workers' Union.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because a few people have put that to me over the years. They said there's such a different Bill that you see on TV to what you used to see. I also think that's what a lot of people say about a lot of Labor leaders. I recall the conversation about Julia Gillard, and we actually saw the real Julia Gillard debate blow up. So I think it's probably unfair to sort of compare what someone's like as a leader of a large national union to sort of how they conduct themselves, having to stand up every day and feed the beast. To me, Bill remains the best organiser of working people I've ever had the privilege of working with. He has this unmet ability to listen to working people in a room, understand the challenges that they're putting forward, but then in a way in which no one else can as concisely put it, repeat back to them their struggle in a way that actually prompts them to take some action, which as an organiser is fundamentally the role. So to this day, there are any number of techniques and habits that I think I observed in Bill that I've tried to replicate in terms of my own organising abilities. And there is no one that I've met that is better in a one-on-one or small group conversation, and quite frankly, large crowd conversation as well, than Bill Shorten is in terms of, being able to identify an issue and activate somebody.
The Esso dispute up in Longford has, at the time of recording, has been going for, I checked today, it was 742 days.
I worry how timeless this recording might be.
Yeah. Give us a bit of a background for the listeners to the podcast about what this dispute is really about, and the follow-up question there is sort of, where are things at the moment in terms of negotiations with the company?
Yeah, so Esso's a really interesting story, and I think to see it in isolation of even just the last 745 days or thereabouts is actually not to understand the bigger challenge that is with Esso. So Esso, ExxonMobil, is, I think, second largest corporation in the world. It has an economy roughly the size of Austria. It is massive. The amount of money that it pulls out of the Bass Strait is in the order of billions of dollars each year. And it is largely a business that relies upon labour to do that. It, like any resource company, its task is to exploit our natural resources and sell them on a national, if not global, market. One of my earliest memories at the AWU was a dispute we had with them back when Bill Shorten was the secretary, and I'd guess that it was probably around 2003, 2004, and it was a campaign called Blood is Thicker Than Oil. And at that point, this was a company that wanted to specifically target the offshore workforce roster that they were on. So tradition in the Bass Strait had been that workers worked a one-on, one-off roster. And that was unique to the world in some respects. There are definitely parts of the world that work similar rosters in the offshore oil and gas industry. But offshore oil and gas is largely an industry that is done at a significant distance from the coastline. So even if it's in the North Sea or off the northwest coast in Australia, it can take hours to get out to some of these platforms. In Victoria, that's less so the case, but it didn't stop the fact that Esso, who at the time were probably only looking at saving, in the order of hundreds of thousands of dollars, wanted to push the workforce from a one-on, one-off roster to a two-on, two-off roster. And the workforce rightly said, no, that just won't work. It's not how we want to live our lives. And any productivity gains that you'd make there are minuscule in comparison to the loss of the quality of life that workers would have. And I remember speaking to a lot of workers at the time who would talk about the fact that, I barely see my family as it is. I spend a week sitting in a tin can in a pretty inhospitable part of the world, in a pretty dangerous workplace at that. And if I move to a two-on, two-off roster, what happens if that two-on just happens to coincide with school holidays? So I could spend, a whole term of my kids' school holidays seeing them on and off and being a pretty absent parent, to then going through the full school holidays, not seeing them at all. And that was something that really struck with me back then. And through a long path of resistance at the time, the workforce were able to resist Esso's attempts. But Esso didn't give up on it. In 2015, 16, started about a pretty concerted campaign to use what we think is a real loophole in the laws, and definitely not something that the Fair Work Act intended to create, to try and target the contractor workforce, because they knew that having the conversation with their own workforce was not going to lead to anything. And we had pretty intractable disputes both with the in-house workforce, so the operators, but also with the contractors. And what they did with the contractors, which is the same technique that was used at the brewery at Carlton United, was to essentially say to a contractor overnight, if you want this work, you've got to provide it under these terms and conditions, and if you don't, see you later. We've got another mob coming in to do it. And so what happened was those workers who were working for UGL KFA at the time, which is a joint venture, two companies working together, were faced with the prospect that a third party, UGL, completely, separate commercial entity, was going to come in and take the work and do so not only on a one-on, one-off roster, but for many workers facing a prospect of 50%, 60% pay cuts, which some people might say, oh, well, these guys, they're on good coin. But as I said before, it's definitely not a lifestyle that I'd be signing up to. It's high-skilled work. It's very dangerous work. And you don't have to go back a long way to find a workplace like at Longford where workers were killed. So the genesis of this dispute started a long, long time ago. And it goes about a ruthless determination of a really, really massive corporation trying to take just that little bit more from working people. And, to the credit of the, couple of hundred guys out there, and they are mainly guys, said, no, enough's enough. Our principles are worth something. And they assembled a picket line. Now, it's been a struggle, as you can imagine, organising a workplace that is geographically impossible to get to stop the company bringing in scabs from all over the country. And they've done so for the last 745 days. Now, look, we continue to, support all the unions involved in terms of trying to get a resolution that's acceptable. But it highlights a few things to me. It highlights the significant concentration of corporate power in this country and the power that companies like Esso have, but also a real failure of our workplace laws. And change rules was a good example of how we tried to rectify, or how we're trying to rectify a lot of those issues.
And that's a good segue into where you are now. You've just begun your journey. Your next chapter in your time in the union movement as the Assistant Secretary at the Australian Council of Trade Unions, and you've joined Sally McManus and Michelle O'Neill and Scott Connolly. What motivated you to seek out that position as the Assistant Secretary?
Yeah, so for me, I'd spent 15 years. In fact, I missed my anniversary by a few days, which I like telling people. 15 years at the ACTU organising workers. And as I said before, organising is one of the most rewarding things you can do. It is extremely difficult, it's brutal, and it's more heartbreaking. It's more often heartbreaking than it is rewarding, especially in the current environment. But I got to a point where I realised that in terms of what I felt was wrong, there were some issues that at a branch of a union, even as holding a national role at various times, I felt I could not satisfactorily sort of address. And about 7 or 8 years ago, so about 4 or 5 years ago, sort of embarked on studying economics because I started to really appreciate that the way in which the economy is talked about is really unapproachable for a lot of working people. And it's sort of mystified by a lot, and I wanted to try and sort of combat that. And that's one of the reasons that I was really attracted to Change the Rules and what it was trying to address. Because, for me, the big problem we've got as a labour movement is that we're not providing a strong enough counter-narrative to this sort of trickle-down economics, neoliberalism that is dominating not just sort of politics, but whole elements of our culture. And I felt that I wanted to stay within unions doing it because I think we are the only sort of non-government organisation, non-political party that has got the capacity to do it. I think the ACTU was the best place for me to sort of channel those efforts.
Let's talk about Change the Rules and the genesis of it. When I think about that campaign, is it a recruitment campaign or is it a campaign that's directed at political power? And some of the rallies that I've been to, I've seen some T-shirts that had Change the Rules on the front. On the back, it had listed all the rules they wanted to change. But I've seen different T-shirts with different rules on it, and I was starting to think...
This is the great thing about distributive leadership.
I know. Well, there was two guys standing next to each other with different T-shirts and different sets of rules. I was going to take a photo, but I thought, no, that's kind of undermining the whole point. But I was like... But it did... What I took away from it was like, well, okay, what is the strategy here behind Change the Rules? Clearly, we do need to change rules. I'm not disputing that, but just talk me through the genesis of this campaign.
So I go back to what I said earlier. So, fundamentally, I think what was arrived at in sort of 2016 is this need that if we are going to be a movement that really wants to tackle inequality, that tinkering around the edges, and I'm not suggesting that's really what we've done in the past, but I think tinkering around the edges was not a way to do it, and that we actually needed really big change. So Change the Rules was about trying to set out a narrative that did address the real problems in society. Trickle-down economics, neoliberalism, and all of the things that fed into it needed to be sort of met head-on. And we didn't feel that political parties were necessarily doing that. So, ultimately, Change the Rules is about growing the movement, because the only way in which we are going to grow the movement is by... so the only way in which we are going to reverse inequality is by growing the movement, because we know and we see it everywhere, and if you need the evidence, you only need to look globally at where we have strong trade unions that have the capacity to bargain for workers, both in their workplace and across their industries, that working people get a decent deal. So ultimately, Change the Rules was about setting out a narrative to build public support around the idea that if we're going to get better wages, we need to have strong unions. If we're going to be able to deal with insecure work, of which Australia has the third highest level of sort of non-conventional type full-time work, then we're going to have to change the rules so that unions have got power to deal with it. And if I just think about just the time that's elapsed since 2009 when the Fair Work Act was sort of introduced, the economy's changed substantially. And unions haven't been able to adapt to it because we've had 30 years of union bashing and union regulation. So unions in Australia are now some of the most regulated in the world in terms of not just how they run themselves, as we see with the latest debate around ensuring integrity, but how they operate in workplaces. That has basically meant that we have been confined to this very narrow enterprise-level bargaining environment, which doesn't really allow us to bring the necessary power to meet the corporate power in terms of setting wages. And if we're a party and a movement committed to reversing inequality, you have to do it through the wages system. Tax and redistribute that's got its place, but it can't do all of the work on its own. We need to have a system that allows working people with, the right bargaining power to sort of get decent wage increases. And that's what Change the Rules was about. It was about sort of setting out a framework and a campaign to build support for it. And for 2 years, I think it worked really, really well in terms of highlighting the issues in this country around wages. And the government knew it because they studiously, in particular during the election campaign, said nothing in relation to industrial relations.
I was going to ask you a question a little bit later on, but you just mentioned about the narrow framework upon which unions can now operate, and that is at an enterprise level. What is the ACTU's position on enterprise bargaining going forward? Do we need to reconsider how unions can seek to improve the wages and conditions of its membership and also, broadly speaking, workers?
Yeah. So, without a doubt, enterprise bargaining is failing most working people. So, as I said to you before, the idea that unions, and I'll give my union as a good example. When I started at the ACTU, and we're largely a manufacturing union in Victoria. We have elements of the resource sector, we have elements of the sort of agricultural sector and some other services, but fundamentally at a manufacturing level, it was sort of steel, aluminium, glass sort of workplaces. When I started at the ACTU, we had workplaces that would have averaged probably close to 40 to 50 workers per workplace. When I left the ACTU, some of those challenges were so acute that in some cases those average workplaces were down as small as sort of 10 to 15. Now, from a membership model point of view, that fundamentally changes the way that some unions are forced to behave, which is why industry-wide bargaining is so important. So as sectors fragment, and I'm not even talking before we even get into new forms of work like gig economy and platform work, just in the conventional sort of, factory-type workplace, whether it be through automation or, a loss of work, these workplaces are much smaller today than they were 10 years ago, let alone 20 years ago, let alone 40 years ago when the most sort of contemporary union model was built. So the model that's needed now is not at an enterprise level. It has to be at an industry level, if not even at a supply chain level. So we've got huge concentrations of power across supply chains, and unions need to be able to meet that power, and they can't do it through enterprise bargaining alone. Now, enterprise bargaining will work in plenty of workplaces. I'm not for a minute saying that it hasn't got a place. I'm saying that it is too narrow a way for which workers can effectively bargain. We need to see bargaining across whole sectors.
What would that look like if you were bargaining across an
Well,
industry?
what we proposed is that there should be some form of multi-workplace bargaining, so industry-level bargaining, where workers, and if need be, sort of an independent umpire, would come to an assessment about how an industry is appropriately organised, and that workers across that industry would be able to bargain an agreement.
Right, okay.
And that's not unusual in the world. I mean, if we go to most of Europe bargains that way, it's really a very Anglo way in which we've developed bargaining at an enterprise level in Australia.
The Change the Rules campaign eventually eventually had a presence in the 2019 federal election. Mm-hmm. When we got down to the brass tacks, no pun intended, of that campaign, I wonder, I just want to propose an idea to you about how unions or the union movement could have tackled the issue of industrial relations, more specifically the issue of wages for workers, for working people, and frame it in a way that is a sort of it is a negative frame, but it kind of hits to the hip pocket of voters in that if the union movement was to say to the electorate that John Howard said that he would not touch industrial relations, and then he brought in work choices. Malcolm Turnbull said he would not touch penalty rates. He lied, and then he cut penalty rates. Scott Morrison is saying that he's not going to touch your wages, but he will lie, and when he gets into government, he will go for your hip pocket. Now, given that everyone's out there right now talking about wage pressures and cost of living and all that kind of stuff, I just wonder, was there a consideration within the ACTU about how you're going to approach your messaging going into the campaign itself?
So Absolutely there was, and to that point, that was definitely considered and I would say acted upon. So come back again to the purpose of Change the Rules, which was to be a broad movement designed to campaign to address the key issues that working people are facing. It was not about winning or losing an election. It was going to continue whether we won or lost, and it will continue into the future. As we approached 2019, it definitely had the flavour and had a stated purpose, which was to change the government. Now, that didn't happen, and there are lots of reasons as to why that didn't. In terms of the effect that Change the Rules was going to have on the election, I would say it was always going to be contingent upon the main parties speaking on our issues broadly. And we had a pretty broad agenda, so it was not going to be hard. And I think before I can move on to the next part, I've got to reflect a bit on the party campaign and how that went.
Sure.
The government studiously spoke about literally one thing and one thing only, and it was essentially taxes and jobs. And they framed the two together, and they ran a very negative, almost an opposition campaign to what Labor's campaign was, which was more of a traditional one of being in government. The challenge that a third-party campaigner like we had was we'd done so well at driving the narrative up to 2019. I don't think anybody can doubt that wages had reached a point in the sort of set of issues that voters really cared about that we'd not seen in, generation. Arguably, even with Your Rights at Work, which was a really specific attack on working people, the idea that we were able to build this support around wages was something, I think really to be commended. What happened in the 2019 campaign is that despite the promises of this being a referendum on wages, that didn't unfold. And I felt that very quickly into the campaign, we were talking about a whole range of issues that were outside of our sort of remit. And I reflect on some times in the campaign where myself and some of the other people in our policy team who had the responsibility of actually doing the hard analysis on Liberal announcements lamented the fact that there weren't any. And literally, if you sort of strolled through their campaign websites, all you would find are pork barrelling initiatives or infrastructure spending, literally nothing of any substance. And it was an extremely sort of narrowcast campaign that made it hard for us to run scare campaigns. Now, we did. I mean, we made it... there was a whole period in the campaign where we were trying to push the message about, the risks associated with the Liberals. We had all this information about what business were saying they wanted to do industrial relations, and there was that weird part in the campaign where I think the IPA let out their 10-point manifesto, which included abolishing the Fair Work Act. But the interest just was not there. And, I mean, the media's focus on Labor was like one of a government, where it literally just was interested in just tearing apart every piece of the Labor agenda.
So when you say the interest was not there, the interest was not there from the media?
From the media, yeah, absolutely. So our ability to sort of capture any attention around IR was really limited. What comforts me about our campaign is I think it was so effective that the Liberals were way too scared to go anywhere near IR, and they did not say a word the whole campaign in relation to it. Now, they're saying a lot now, and I think, to your point, clearly what we had been saying about the risks associated with electing a Morrison government and the risks for working people are starting to be borne out in their agenda now, which is essentially twofold. One, which is to continue to attack unions because they realise how effective we are at improving people's wages and conditions. And two, to seriously open up this Pandora's box of reviewing workplace relations laws and the roles that unions play in workplaces. So, I think there's a lot more to be seen then, and I think that's where we will continue to go with Change the Rules, in terms of sort of making the case that if you're going to deal with the wages crisis in this country, which we really shouldn't sort of underestimate its significance. We are seeing wages growing at the lowest rate since the Second World War. We have the highest levels of inequality in a generation, that we now have a government that is studiously ignoring this really significant, not just social problem, but economic problem. So, in terms of where Change the Rules sort of went during the campaign, I think we were pushing against a tide where no one wanted to talk on these issues. And the party tried to, but I do believe it was overwhelmed by just the sheer range of other issues that were flowing through.
I think you're a bit of an internationalist in the sense that you do cast your eye overseas, both in politics and in industrial relations and social movements, I have started to reconsider the experiment that is social democracy in the light of this last election. That sounds daunting.
Authoritarianism.
Yeah.
Czar Stephen.
Absolutely. It's either my way or the highway. No. And what I've discovered in my time while I still worked for the Australian Labor
I'll
Party.
move to your socialist enclave.
Yeah, thank you. Please do. I don't know if anyone else will join me. I've been blessed in my time that when I worked for the party that I got to travel to the places like the United States, New Zealand, Europe, Britain. I notice how I said Britain wasn't part of Europe there.
I like how when we go internationalist, we've picked the 3 Anglo nations.
Yeah, I know. I've been to the Maldives as well. They just started up a Labor Party out of the reason because their workers needed a voice in Parliament. The Australian Labor Party is quite unique in that we have a very, very strong relationship between our industrial wing and our political wing, more so than the Democratic Party has in the United States. I know there's a lot of things going on inside the Democrats right now that is sort of pushing that party to the left, but essentially they are a centrist party, or have been historically from the 1970s onwards. And the Labor Party in Britain is also an interesting experiment at the moment. But I am starting to, we are now 2 election wins from 6 or 7 dating back to...
1 parliamentary majority in 30 years by the time we're going to get to the next election.
Really depressing stat, that.
Yep.
And I am starting to think, was the Hawke-Keating government a fluke? Or are we as a broader movement not making a connection with whoever that group of voters are, and I don't think people can agree on who that group of voters are anyway. Are we failing to make a connection with them to say, we'll put a government in our hands and we'll do a good job and we'll make your lives better?
So I think this is the most important question that the Labor movement has to answer and has to reconcile. So to your point,
it may be the most important question I've ever asked in a podcast.
Well, that remains to be seen. I can't think of any others, so it's a winner for me so far. So I'll probably express this in a really crude way, but I think of a modern Labor Party as trying to blend economic with social justice. And often those two rub up against each other in some really uncomfortable ways, and we saw that in the last election. And I don't want to pick on particular issues that I would describe as social justice issues and how they potentially alienated people that I think we quite easily capture about economic justice. But I want to add some of the stats that you just sort of put forward in terms of 30 years and we've formed 1 parliamentary majority. A lot of talk this election has been about Queensland and Victoria. Victoria Labor received a swing to it, and in Queensland, Labor, comfortably had a swing against it. Now, let me start at the outset. I think it's foolish to think we just look at Queensland and think there's the problem. Where I live in the western suburbs of Melbourne, the same contrast can be identified. Go sort of to the outer west and you will see swings against the Labor Party in what I would describe as working class areas, and swings to the Labor Party in what I would see as the more gentrified urban areas. And that's pretty consistent across Victoria, South Australia. You see very similar trends there, and even in New South Wales. In terms of the Victorian-Queensland dynamic, in the same sense that nationally we formed 1 parliamentary majority in 30 years, in both of those states, state Labor has lost 1 election in each of those periods, in each of those states. So it's not right to say that Queensland is this sort of natural favourite hunting ground for Liberals. State Labor governments have done very well in those states, and likewise in Victoria. For all the talk about Daniel Andrews being the most progressive premier, or maybe the most progressive person ever lived, Labor has been able to form a very comfortable winning position since 98. And if you exclude the 2 terms of the Kennett government, you can go back to a long way.
82, yeah.
So there's something in that. And what I would put that down to is at a state level, we do put economic interest really front and centre in terms of the messaging and in terms of the policy development. when Daniel Andrews is out there talking about a particular social issue, and it might be the environment, and I don't want to for a minute say that there are not economic elements to talking about climate change, jobs is what is often the sort of leading narrative. And likewise in Queensland. And I think what federal Labor needs to understand is that it's through the prism of talking about wages and jobs that Labor gets to talk about the economy. Too much of the national debate about economic management is put into this liberal frame about, who's best to deliver tax cuts, who's best to deliver economic growth, and none of it is actually things that working people can easily relate to. So again, back to the task, which is how does federal Labor or a modern Labor Party sort of talk about those issues? It has to reconcile with working people first in terms of building a narrative and a message that really is about economic fairness first and foremost. To the extent that we can build a coalition that includes social progressives that, quite frankly, probably don't sit within our economic wheelhouse, I would caution against reaching too far in that direction that potentially compromises our ability to hold that base together.
Yep. Are you going to crack at Andrew Lee there with his article?
No, not having a crack at anybody. I think we have to be much more disciplined on an economic message. And Andrew Lee's, quite frankly, one of the better ones in terms of talking about inequality and the issues that are going on in terms of wealth distribution in this country. It is a real issue, and I think federally Labor has to keep that core economic message front and centre.
Let's talk about organising.
Yep.
And I just want to give us some context for the viewers at home. I say the viewers at home because I did a podcast years ago with a mate of mine, and he constantly referred to people as the viewers at home, but he wasn't being ironic. We didn't have any cameras in the room, but he kept on saying viewers at home, and I did let him go with it. And now I think that I just kept on using that, even though the same deal, we don't have cameras here. But for those people who are not aware of, I guess, the backstory, and correct me...
Is that a question out there to say, maybe we should turn this into like a TV show?
Yeah, I think so. Absolutely. Don't tempt me. I might get my phone out and start filming you in a minute. Up until the 1990s, the Australian industrial landscape was workplaces had compulsory unionism essentially, and the 1996 Workplace Relations Act kind of completely killed that off. Up until that point, union officials, as opposed to union organisers, basically, and this is before I started working in the union movement as well, but these are the tales of past secretaries told me, would go around to yards, this is from my TW background, would go into yards and basically collect their monthly or weekly or fortnightly dues, belt up anyone that wasn't in the union, got them to join the union, and just try and deal with disputes. So effectively service workplaces. Yep. Compulsory union comes in, non-compulsory unionism is introduced. All of a sudden, a whole bunch of people leave the union, and then this organising model, which is introduced to empower workers in workplaces to take on leadership roles, to help organise those workplaces, sign people up to the union, empower them to take ownership of their issues, and then an organiser as opposed to an official, could move around all of those workplaces, organise those workplaces, empower them to take ownership of their own issues in those workplaces, so that organiser could then move to non-unionised workplaces and try and organise them.
Yep.
That is essentially...
Yep.
Organising.
It is. There's maybe a few other nuances that I think need to be sort of captured. So if we think about the industrial relations landscape and the history of it in Australia, it reached its peak of servicing in the Hawke era. I mean, centralised wage fixing basically meant that, Bill Kelty, the 21st cabinet member, was going to sit there and do your wage deal for you, and the purpose of unions was just to make sure it rolled out through the economy. So that was the peak of servicing. And yes,
that's a very good point, yeah.
The erosion of closed shops definitely contributed to the need to drive organising, but also enterprise bargaining definitely forced that shift in a much more rapid way, because ultimately the mechanism to which you achieved outcomes in your working life was less dependent upon a peak body sitting there negotiating its wages with Bob Hawke, and more so on your ability to exercise power in your workplace. So it forced through the 90s. And in the late 90s or mid to late 90s, organising works have evolved out of the ACTU, and there was a real push to roll that out through the movement, and it was quite successful against a really challenging economic environment where enterprise bargaining was being foisted upon us, and again unions had to adapt. And many can argue about how we've gone. We've gone from a period in '96 of 30 2% density to a point, obviously now tracking a little bit below 15, but stable in that respect. It has been significantly challenging. But I think you rightly point out that there was a significant push in the late 90s to sort of force the movement to take on organising. And I was a graduate of Organising Works. It was, something that my union prioritised. It was something that Bill in particular, who was one of the first graduates of Organising Works, really impressed upon us that being able to get out there and get working people to stick together is fundamental to union business. And I say this to sort of social progressives out there. If you want to learn organising and if you want to organise and see real rewards for the work, going and getting involved in a union is the best way to do it. Organising in a political context, I'm sure, has huge rewards and opportunities, but organising people in a very deep and meaningful way is really well done by unions. So that's definitely been a push. Again, I think it's taken on lots of iterations. Talk about distributive leadership and the role that plays in terms of organising, both in a political context around change the rules, but now we're seeing it in a workplace context where you're seeing large and dispersed workplaces taking on distributive organising models where rank and file activists determine what issues they're going to campaign on.
So my question to you then is, and political organising does have its
No, I'm not saying it doesn't.
We've changed the odd government here and there. The organising model, is it a failed experiment, or is it going through some transitions because of the way that we communicate with people? It just needs to come through a new iteration. Like, where is it going right now? And also with that question, I sort of think about some unions or like I want to talk to union officials, I'll ask them, I've been a union organiser for 10 years, right? So I've been out of the game for quite some time, but I'll check in with people and say, well, are you guys still kind of organising? And they'll say, well, we kind of are, but we sort of aren't because we've got all of these other competing interests and stuff. So is it just a mission that we've not completed? And if we did, we would be in a better shape, or the union movement would be in a better shape? Or do we have to sort of start evolving how we organise?
So I think union organising or organising working people in workplaces presents challenges that are, really dynamic. To start with, you have an opponent in the workplace that is active every day trying to knock down your attempts to organise in a much more direct way, I imagine, than a lot of political organising is. So I'd also say it is highly dependent upon the industry. So there are some industries where large workplaces where the typical union organising model works just fine. I think about our public services, so nurses and teachers, the unions that have done and succeeded really well, and I'm not taking it all away from the work that they've done, have done so because of, the size of the industry, the single employer nature to it. And where I think unions, particularly in the private sector, have struggled, have been so because of those challenges and the further fragmenting of industry. So I do think the distributive leadership model has a lot of benefits in terms of, if we're sort of seeing with an eye to the future, what's likely to continue is that really what unions need to be doing is investing in leaders, both at a workplace level, but also at a union branch and national level, that can, really multiply the power of organising at a workplace level. And that's something that I think has been very difficult for unions to do because of the sheer amount of pressure that unions are on, both financially and politically. And we shouldn't forget, and I think this is often overlooked, in terms of brand union, we have had 30 years of assaults. Literally every day, you see stories just bashing unions. So we've got a whole generation of young people that don't have that sort of an experience. So I'd just say that the task that the organising model's trying to address is a much more challenging one than it was 5 years ago, let alone 10, 20 years ago.
Give us some examples that you have seen out there in unions that they're trying to approach organising and building membership and workplace power. They're using a different approach. I'm interested in hearing some of those.
Yeah, so I sort of see this, and I've got a really sort of maybe overly simplistic way of sort of explaining this, but I see the challenge that unions have got at the moment as part of it's sectoral, and I've explained the changing nature of how industries and markets are fragmenting at a rate that means that enterprise bargaining is not as viable than it was, say, 20 years ago. So that's one set of challenges. But work now is also changing pretty rapidly, and whether it be Uber and the sort of gig economy and how that sort of works. Part of the problem we in the union movement have is that we have one membership model, and it literally is very much focused around that bargaining model. And that's because I think more often than not we try to sit there and go, well, how do we create value for working people such that they will hand over $10, $12 a week to do it? And enterprise bargaining clearly does it. We are excellent at it. The union premium today is close to $300 a week. So if you were to take someone in the same job, one union, one not, obviously in different workplaces because enterprise bargaining covers union and non-union members, you see a significant premium there. But that basically is because most of our models are built for bargaining. What we have started to try and do, and there are two really good examples, one from my union and one from United Voice, is create alternative membership models which recognise that the bargaining model is not viable in this industry, and we try to create other forms of joining and action that lead to justice. So in the case of the AWU, again, the broad coverage the AWU has, we have coverage of hairstylists in many states in the country and have developed the Hairstylists Association. And this was born on the back of a campaign by the New South Wales government to significantly mess with the trade arrangements that hairstylists had to sort of meet in order to gain access to the industry. And it was a real attack on the trade. So they built this model, and it's still in its early days, and it's had some success. But we're seeing people in hair salons joining unions in a way which has never happened before. The other one, which for most people that live in and around Melbourne will know, is Hospo Voice, which is again recognising the fact that the union membership model for a cafe worker is not one where they're going to sign up to United Voice and get an enterprise agreement and suddenly lift themselves out of a pretty nasty situation in terms of wage theft, no penalty rates, things like that. So creating this model whereby you would create this sort of a cross-industry model of action targeted at specific employers who are engaging in wage theft has meant that wage theft, quite frankly, is being discussed in a way in which would never have occurred without it. So I think those are two examples of it, but I think those examples should be able to be iterated by unions into many other opportunities across industry where bargaining is not viable. And that's the key thing that I think unions have tried to address. And what Change the Rules was really trying to do was to say, well, let's make bargaining more viable on one hand, and that project should still continue. But on the other hand, the model stuff is also about saying, well, where that's not possible, what are the union offerings that can do that?
Your role at the ACTU, you correct me if I'm wrong, you're overseeing a lot of the occupational health and safety work. What role is things like OH&S, workplace bullying, mental health, equal pay, things that, sorry, not equal pay, equal pay. Yeah. No, I do mean equal pay, things that are not specifically related to their wages, although the equal pay one does, but the conditions.
Yep.
People are more comfortable about talking about mental health these days in workplaces and in society in general. People are more comfortable about talking about workplace bullying, for example. These are good things that the union movement have stood to represent workers on for a very long time anyway. Yep. But is this a new approach or a new way of entering into workplaces and giving relevancy to workers, whether they're in the union or not, and saying, hey, this is what we do actually. We've been doing this for a very long time. How can we help you in overcoming these challenges? Yeah,
so I think this is a really interesting time to be doing this, especially in light of the fact that obviously we're not going to see our workplace bargaining type laws change. There are opportunities around safety. So firstly, I'd say with regards to OH&S, from a strategic point for our movement, it's an area where we should be much, much more vocal than maybe we have been in the past. And that's because, set aside what people's views on unions are and their roles in workplaces, one of the areas where we're least contested in terms of playing an important role is making workplaces safe. Not that I have many Liberal mates, but even those that don't necessarily have favourable views of unions will say, but thank God you're there making my son's job safer. So I think when we talk about safety, we come from an area of really high social licence. And I think that's important strategically as a movement that we continue that, because when we start talking about the areas like bargaining and the economic interests, where we do butt up against some real opposition, it's important that we've done so through a framework of people understanding the positive roles that unions play across the workplace. So that's the first thing I'd say. Second to that, OH&S is a really important issue for working people. I was always fascinated. We ran a lot of surveys, and including a national census at the ACTU every 4 years. And particularly for young workers, OH&S rates really highly in terms of their priorities. So it's often not wages, and yes, job security is a big issue, but OH&S is really important. And if you think about it logically, for a young person that's walking into a factory or a heavy industry type of workplace, in the first few years you look around and you go, shit, this stuff can really do some damage to you. I hope it's fucking safe. So the union plays a really important role in that respect. And in recent years, issues around mental health, bullying, workloads have become even more so. So when it comes to what we call sort of psychological health, which is an obligation that employers have got to ensure in our workplace health and safety laws, psychological health has been severely impacted in recent years. The fastest growing compensable claim in our workers' comp system is mental stress. And if you think about it, even for, and again, if we think about safety, traditionally it's something that's often farmed off and thought of as a blue-collar type issue, and I sort of described an example of that just before. But when we talk about increasing workloads, increasing work hours, high job demands, that is something that is across the board, blue-collar, white-collar, something that people understand. And it's something that, as a movement, we're really committed to campaigning around, because I think what we've tried to do when it comes to things like workloads is deal with them in a bargaining environment, make it a productivity type of issue and say, well, we deserve X and Y because we are doing 10, 20, 30% more work than we were 3 years ago. So, we need to get this right. Increasingly, I speak to, workers, both blue collar and white collar, who at times will say, look, wages are not the most important thing in my life at the moment. What the most important thing in my life is making sure that, quite frankly, I'm able to come to work and do my job, and that I'm getting, sufficient reward for that. And that's not about money, it's about being able to have the time to do it. So I think, our hope is that we want to run more campaigns around mental health and workplace stress, because we think it is a really important part of our safety narrative, but it's also a really important part for working people.
Can we turn our attention to the United States too? Today is the 3rd of July, tomorrow is the 4th of July. And the United States are going through the early days of their primary season, particularly for the Democratic Party. Have you been following, you said at the start of the podcast that you've been slowly checking into your podcasts again.
Yeah, periodically gleaning the headlines, I think is probably the best best description.
Did you see the debates last week?
No, I didn't see them, but I've seen reporting of them. And, I'll sort of confess, it's probably going to see a few people shriek listening to this. I was, I think, one of the few people in Australia who was a Bernie Sanders supporter. And before anyone sort of switches this off and stops now, it wasn't necessarily on a policy front, although there are a lot of things, and I've spoken about a lot of issues today that clearly fall within the sort of Bernie bro wheelhouse. But I think at the time I really understood the change nature of the 2016 election. And I was really, quite hopeful that, and nothing against Clinton, but really hopeful to see a challenge between Sanders and Trump, because I think in many respects that is the most contested territory in America, and I think it's becoming so in Australia as well. And it is this contest for working people. So when I look at the 2020 Democratic field, I looked with an eye to that. And I don't necessarily think that is Bernie Sanders or, for that matter, Joe Biden. I think it is a challenge for Democrats that they have to be able to pivot to getting back to talking to working people, because the more I keep looking at the Democratic primaries unfolding, I feel there is a real risk of repeating the mistakes of 2016. And there were some really good examples, and you might quiz me on names and I'll forget them, of Democrats that did, well in House elections over the last 2 years that clearly confronted these economic issues and did so well.
Actually, can I tell you a story that might horrify you, and I'll share with...
You're a Bernie bro too?
No, yeah. That would horrify me. I was over in the States in 2016, towards the last couple of weeks, with our well-documented Aussies for Hillary campaign, which is more of a laugh than anything else, nothing to be taken too seriously. But on a serious note, I did then go to an event that's held in November, late November every year. It used to be organised by the National Institute of Organising. It's now organised by Wellstone. It's called Roots Camp. Mm-hmm. And it is a 2-day event in Washington, D.C. that invites everyone and anyone from the progressive side of politics, mm-hmm. whether you be an electoral organiser, a community organiser, data, digital, mm-hmm. policy, you name it, they're all there. And I was in a particular session, which was, I think it was actually titled Organising Millennials. I'm not a millennial, obviously. I am very firmly in Gen X, Y, one of them.
Was it run by millennials?
It was.
Oh, good. Okay, that's good.
That's why I went. So I went, I want to hear what the young people are saying these days. And someone else was in the room. I didn't realise there was a bunch of Australians that were over as well, Labor Party people. Yeah. And I won't say her name, so I don't want to embarrass her. But what she said was what most Australian Labor Party people would have thought as well. And she got up when they were starting to ask questions, and she said, look, I'm from the Australian Labor Party, and our party is from the trade union movement. And I've been in this room today, and you've all spoken about a lot of issues that are incredibly important and that make the coalition that is so wonderful about the left over here in the United States. You talked about LGBT rights, you've talked about women's rights, you've talked about Black Lives Matter, you've talked about a whole bunch of other things. But none of you, and I say this with respect because I come from a working background in Australia, none of you have spoken about workers. And isn't it true that even though the dust has yet to settle in this election campaign, it could be argued that Donald Trump won because he appealed to a common denominator right across all of those, talk about intersectionality. Everybody wants jobs, and everybody wants good paying jobs or job security. And as moronic as Donald Trump is, maybe he communicated that a little bit better than Hillary did. Yet none of you in this room have spoken about workers' rights in this meeting. And I can't remember what someone said, but someone said, honey, that's not our role to do that. Or basically dismissed it completely. And first of all, I was like, good on you for getting up and saying that, because I sure as hell wasn't going to say anything, but I was thinking the same thing. Yeah. And I walked out of that room depressed, thinking if that's the future of the Democratic Party, then they're in big trouble.
Absolutely. And I think it was telling in the 2016 election where unions were campaigning, and not in any way sort of a criticism of individual unions, but we think about the Democratic Party and the establishment, and I think a lot of that to me sounded like a lot of negative rhetoric, but it was borne out by the fact that unions were flat-footed when it came to the 2016 election. I've seen endless stories now of unions that throughout that sort of Rust Belt saw their members voting for Trump in ways in which would horrify many of us. And I worry. I mean, I talk about the May election as maybe a sort of insight as to where this goes in Australia, but I think unions need to be very conscious of the fact that working people are up for grabs, and they're up for grabs in a really serious way when it comes to the sort of new breed of sort of global type conservatives that, quite frankly, are not liberals. They have a really clear economic message that is tailored to working people. And so when I think of the 2020 election, I look to a Democratic field, and quite frankly, I just hope that we see someone sort of get the nomination that has the capacity to have that conversation with working people in America. Because, I was commenting with someone the other day, remember when we used to think George Bush was like the worst type of Republican? I fear 2026 looking back and going, what are people going to say about Donald Trump, and who the hell is going to be the Republican front runner? in their upcoming 2028 election or whatever it's going to be. But, American unions and the Democratic Party have got to get back to, talking to working people because, I think more often than not we're seeing Australia heading in a similar direction. And, I'm interested to see what happens in 2020.
And I guess that goes to the point that we were speaking about earlier. I think we are blessed in Australia that we have got a formal relationship that exists between the Labor Party and the trade union movement. And I know there are people in both the industrial and the political wing that have made in the past arguments about why it shouldn't exist or there should be some kind of separation. I've always been very much of the camp, having worked in both sides of the movement, that it needs to coexist because of the American experiment, because of the Democratic Party, what happened to them in the 1970s where they started to just move towards the big corporate donations and weren't reliant on the support, both financially and in people power from the union movement. That would be a big problem for us. And I think the union movement keeps the Labor Party honest through our all of our processes, national conferences, state conferences, policy bodies and the like, to just say, just check yourself there, big fella. Don't you get too carried away and forget about working people.
Yep.
So I think that's important.
But I would say just one thing. I think too often in the relationship, and I don't want to necessarily say this is what happened in the last election, is that maybe the party says, so let me rephrase this. It shouldn't be seen as a sort of transactional arrangement. I think in many respects, at least in the last 2 years, it's been seen as less so because it's not like there's this sort of coming together of the party and the movement to sort of nut out a deal that's acceptable to the movement when it comes to its core set of issues that the party can then go and campaign on the issues that it sees as sort of winning elections. I think what we've seen now, and this election wasn't a great example of it in terms of how the campaign unfolded, is that our issues, the issues that unions campaign on, wages, job security, are really central to a progressive political party. And that has to be seen as it's a symbiotic relationship and not one of sort of checks and balances, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. And I think that the strength of that relationship probably helped that the leader came from the union.
Yeah,
movement.
Absolutely.
I think there have been leaders in the past that have done exactly what you're saying there, that it has been a transactional thing. Yeah. I'm not mentioning any names, Kevin Rudd. Do you... Just looking at the democratic primary process, and I know this has been thrown up before, but I just thought about this question just then. Would you consider the Labor Party having primaries to select our candidates for public office?
Well, I can't say that I haven't got a view because I think in my earlier days I've talked profusely about what a sort of modern relationship would look like in terms of unions and a primary process. So. Firstly, let me say, the US political system is one of the most stupid political systems you could write to governing a democracy. And the primary system is just amplifying that. That being said, I think there's something to be said with how it forces candidates and parties to do a lot of grassroots organising that would be really helpful in an Australian context. And I've often thought that primaries, in a broader sense, would have a really positive role in Australia. And I think where they've been tested in some pretty poor circumstances.
Yeah, set up to fail.
And absolutely set up to fail. Way back when, I think probably pre the 2007 election, I was a real champion of the idea that the ALP should have primaries, that it should seek to expand its base beyond those that have decided that they are prepared to part with the however much money to join the party and show up to a branch meeting. But I actually was more appealing to the idea that parties and candidates would appeal to union members on a more sort of micro way and trying to engage working people in the party's broader processes. So I'm not opposed to the idea, and for those that know me, I've spoken before about the need for the parties to sort of reach out to supporters, and I think the work that you did was really great in terms of how it brought people who are clearly Labor people into the fold to get involved in politics. But I think there is definitely some merit in terms of how union members might be engaged. And I think, I don't want to introduce a debate about Corbyn, but I think the way in which the UK Labor system works has some real positives that should be looked at seriously. I don't think this is the solution to our problems. I think our problems are much more in the sort of campaigning space. But I think there's some really interesting ideas about how we engage union members in the selection of people for public office.
Absolutely. We could go on and on about the primaries, but we are pressed for time. Look, I just want to turn our attention to some other things. I know that you like cycling, and this is the moment when everyone stops listening except for Cos Samaras.
Cos, yeah.
So those who are going, we're going to talk about the Tour de France now. But if you are, I'm serious, when I do this all of every podcast, if you are leaving now, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast, share the podcast with your friends, tell more people about it. Thanks for listening to today's episode. Hope you have a great week. So, the Tour de France.
Firstly, you better make sure Cos listens to this episode.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's your job. You are a cyclist, and I'm just keen to get your thoughts. The tour starts this coming weekend.
It does.
Since Cadel Evans won in 2011, the Sky Train has dominated all but one tour.
Yep.
There are some injuries to that team at the moment.
Now called Team Ineos.
Team Ineos. Yeah. What is Ineos? Do you know?
No, I don't actually know. I should check this out.
It wasn't.
It's not a product that I've come across, so I'm not buying it.
Well, it wasn't until
but I wasn't buying Sky either because of these guys.
That is true. It wasn't until I went to Spain I went, Banesto's a bank, right? Okay, Sorry. So there is a chance here that this may be an open field for the first time, and I've really not enjoyed the last couple of tours because it's so goddamn boring.
Well, this is the thing. So I think, and I'm sure Cos would agree, and a lot of cycling enthusiasts would agree, is that, the Tour de France is the biggest annual sporting event in the world. It's definitely the sort of sporting event that a lot of people who have a sort of vague interest in cycling engage in. I often find it's an interesting mix of people who like France and like bike racing, and that seems to meld the two, and people who don't sleep a lot as well.
My
get involved
red wine consumption and cheese consumption over this period of July peaks.
But the thing with the Tour de France is that it highlights to me how rigged the cycling sport is. And there's two things. Obviously, the Tour de France is the most cheated on sporting event in history, not just because of the drugs, but even back before the drugs, go to the early Tour de France's, and it was routine that cyclists would take shortcuts and cheat and all sorts of things. So cheating has a real long history in cycling, in particular in the Tour de France. But what it highlights for me, and you mentioned Team Sky, is just how inequitable the sport is set up. And you contrast that to, say, AFL, where you have salary caps and there's clearly this idea of trying to level the playing field. In cycling, that's not the case. And in fact, rules are there to be broken, and the deck is always designed to be sort of stacked. And if you compare, say, Team Sky to sort of your average team, you're talking sort of a budget annually of $30 million to a budget annually of $5 million. Like it is night and day. And it's sort of amplified in a 3-week Grand Tour where literally you can buy, 5 of the top 20 riders, stick them on the front of the race for 4 hours, and that's it. Nothing you can do to beat those guys. So drugs is sort of like the final thing that sort of aids and abets the cheating. So for me, I like watching the Tour de France, but it's not the thing that sort of really attracts you to cycling. The one-day races that happen often in spring and autumn are the real sort of exciting times. But yeah, this year, for the first time, it's definitely a wide-open race. Team Ineos lost Chris Froome a few weeks ago to a crash, and they've got Geraint Thomas, who is really under-raced this year, and he's the defending champion. There's a young Colombian, Egan Bernal, who's definitely one of the most capable cyclists in the world, but there's a sort of question mark on whether he's too young.
Is there going to be a competition with him and Geraint Thomas?
Well, one imagines there will be over time, like in the same way there was last time with Froome and Thomas, and it really wasn't until the last week that it was really comfortably settled that Thomas was going to lead. I think what often happens is that you really need to look at what the race is shaping up like after the first week, because it just takes 1 or 2 crashes, and Bernal went down in a crash early last time that sort of scratched his prospects of being up there, because otherwise, they would have had a few up there that would have done okay. But it is a wide open race. It's going to be okay. I might actually stay up to watch the finish of a few stages this year.
I was actually looking at the stats the other day of the part during the Sky domination, years of domination. When Cadel won in 2011, he won one stage and he held the yellow jersey for the final two stages. So he basically got the yellow jersey, in the penultimate or third last stage.
Yep.
It took that into...
The time trial's often the second last stage, which means that if you're a good time trialist, like Cadell was,
That's
you
right.
have a chance of winning.
Yeah. So really, up until that point, and what made that such a great tour was because it was the Maillot Jaune was constantly up for grabs.
Yep.
And there were some great stages before that. Was it Tommy Vauclair?
Tommy Vauclair was holding it for days and really fought to keep it over some pretty decent mountains that someone like him shouldn't be able to.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was gutsy stuff, right? But then you look at the stats since then, the eventual winner may have only won one or two or maybe three stages, but they held the yellow jersey for on average between 14 and 17 stages of the tour. So they kind of set the agenda early and then just hung on all the way through.
And again, it comes back to that function of Team Sky and having the depth of riders that they did. If you think about the one year that Team Sky didn't win, the year that Nibali won, it was because Froome crashed out on a cobbled stage, and they just didn't have anyone to sort of replace him at that level. So I think this should be a much more open field. It'd be nice to think that Australians like Port would do well.
Yeah, what do you think about Richie Port's chances?
Well, I think he's had such bad luck the last 2 years, and you've got to think this is really sort of do or die for Port. But he's performed well, did well when he was in Australia, had a good early season. There's no reason why he shouldn't, feature. It's just about having good luck, and that's what often happens with these. It is literally about good luck because you have bad luck and it's over.
And the team around you as well. The tour. What's his name? Not his actual name, but what's his job? The tour, the guy that basically makes up the whole tour program.
Oh yeah,
the tour director.
Yeah,
has said that he
Jonathan Prudhomme.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, has said that he's tried to construct stages that he's basically designed to try and break up the Sky Train. There's only one individual time trial this time. It's quite short, like 27 Ks. And there are more stages now that are at...
I feel like I'm getting a good briefing here.
Higher altitude. Yeah, no, I've been reading up a little bit. They're at higher altitude.
Yeah.
And in fact, the final sort of 4 or 5 stages in the Pyrenees before they head to Paris, there's like what they do, Tourmalet. There's a whole bunch where there was one stage there where there are 5 category climbs. That's going to be huge, right? And it's just to try and see if they can break up the Sky Train. I think it's amazing that the tour director, it's kind of like, trying to lay a wicket in cricket that's going to be favourable to a certain type of...
Well, they've failed dismally for the last decade.
They really have. And it's kind of, I think it's got on his nerves. He's really trying to bust this open.
The French hate Team Sky. They
they're
literally...
English.
Well, no, it's a bit... It's gotten out of hand in the last few years. So Chris Froome obviously is coming for a lot of criticism by the French, and the suggestions around, the doping allegations, really, hit peak last year. But it's definitely rubbed off on the fact that, the ASOs, those that run the Tour de France, have definitely tried to engineer a parcours that would not be favourable for the Team Sky.
Yeah, it will be fascinating to watch. Last question.
Yeah.
If you could ride one stage of the Tour de France, which one would you choose? Think about all the different stages over the years. Like, first of all, would you go for a mountain stage, or would you just try and coast it and do the final day? So
I've been to 2 Tour de France's. I went in 2008 and I went in 2014. In 2014, I actually got out and saw a few stages down in the Pyrenees and Bergerac. And the mountains are unbelievable. It is, I think, we talk about mountains in Australia and it just doesn't compare.
Yeah, kidding yourself.
So from a countryside, it's just phenomenal. But actually, where I would far rather go and ride my bike and watch racing is in the north of France. So, I would love to go and watch Paris-Roubaix, and all of the sort of Belgian classics. They're the sort of...
Flanders and...
and be there for the sort of 2 weeks that they do those big races.
Right,
It's a completely different culture. So the French do the Tour de France really well. The Belgians are just fanatical about cycling. It is the national sport. And outside of football, there's nothing else other than cycling.
Interesting. I know some people that organise some tours. Yeah, I might be able to hook you up with that, but I won't do it on the podcast because that would be really
I'm
boring.
trying to organise some sort of, ILO visit to sort of coincide with Paris-Roubaix, and I don't know that Sally's quite accommodated my request yet.
Well, good luck with that. And good luck with your tenure at the ACTU. Thank you very much for coming on today's podcast. It's been incredibly enjoyable.
Yeah, it has been great fun.
And
Cheers.
best of luck with the future.
Thank you. You too.